Hello friends! We're on a quest to raise the percentage of players that have beaten Oxygen Not Included, which means they completed the final objective by sending a rocket to the temporal tear without using sandbox tools or debug commands. We started at only 1.4%, and I need your help to raise that number. This video and many others will be dedicated to helping players finish the game, and if you do, you can send me your save file using the form in the description, and I may show it off in an upcoming video. With that said, let's get started. Hi friends and welcome back. This video is the second part in a series all about identifying what you need at each stage of the game to have a stable and well-running base. In part 1, we identified the three major components of the collective mid-game struggle, and we also identified all the systems that you'll need in order to smoothly enter the mid-game. I also compared the early game to baking a cake, and if you don't finish baking it, when you're ready to put the frosting on, it's going to be a disaster. It's definitely a weird metaphor, but I think it makes sense, and I like this picture. If you haven't watched part 1 or aren't confident in your early game setup, it might be worth a watch. Alright, so what's mid-game all about? I would say the overall objective is to maintain permanent sustainability, meaning every resource consumed is replaceable and you won't ever run out of a resource that you're relying on. The first thing you'll want to do once your prior builds have stabilized is start exploring the map in search of geysers, vents, and volcanoes. If you're ever going to have sustainable oxygen, food, or power, then you need a renewable source of the resources that those things are going to use. And geysers are basically free resource printers. At this phase of the game, if you happen to find polluted water vents or cool slush geysers, you can start using them now since they don't need any kind of advanced materials to use. Be careful though, because geysers like the regular water geyser, saltwater geyser, cool steam vent, and many more are still useful, but a majority of them are just too hot to start messing with before we have some serious cooling infrastructure. Even if you're not able to use every geyser right away, it's good to know what you have so you can plan accordingly. I'll make videos specifically about every single one of these geysers, and some of them are borderline necessary to completing the game, so get out there and find them. Another aspect of mid-game is our power consumption is really going to increase, so we need another power source. And speaking of geysers, one of the more common and extremely useful ones is the natural gas geyser. Which, why is this not called a vent? Everything else like this is called a vent, I don't know. Anyway, most maps will spawn with this, and now is a good time to take it. Be aware that in order to properly capture and harvest a natural gas geyser, you're going to need steel. This is because the natural gas is emitted at 150 C, but most materials that you would build a gas pump out of can't resist more than 75. Steel can resist the heat that natural gas geysers will put out, but it's not an easily available resource right now. You can salvage some steel from these doors near the somnium synthesizer, or these doors in a point of interest out in the space biome in the base game. If you don't have access to either of these, you can also produce steel from the metal refinery, but don't produce too much yet without at least having a second power source running, because we likely won't have the power and cooling to handle it for very long. If you need to produce your own steel, just produce a few batches, use the naturally occurring polluted water on the map as a coolant, and vent the hot polluted water to space. We'll get a better metal refinery setup later, but don't overuse this until we're ready, just get a few rounds of steel and call it good. One of the key resources to make sustainability happen is oil. On the base game starter map, the oil biome is at the bottom of the base, but it can take a little while to get down there. Now is a good time to start expanding downward and get to the bottom of the map, but it's not easy to just build all the way down in one shot. I like to build in a handful of sections at a time and push my ventilation down as I go. This will keep the base as breathable as possible so duplicants don't need to travel halfway across the map to get air. Personally, I don't find it worthwhile right now to use oxygen masks or Atmos suits just to dig around the map, but you can always do it that way if you want. Once you hit the bottom, now it's time to start harvesting that oil. Your duplicants will need Atmos suits by the time you start working down here because the oil biome is typically very hot and your duplicants will not be able to survive without using Atmos suits. The oil biome should start with quite a bit of oil just chilling in some pockets at the bottom, and unless you're burning a lot of oil or petroleum for energy, this naturally occurring amount could potentially last you the rest of the game. Crude oil can be refined into petroleum, which is very useful as a power source and to make plastic. I'll always recommend using the oil refinery to get petroleum started, even though there are builds to create petroleum at a better ratio. Those petroleum boiler builds will require a lot more advanced things that we don't really have access to right now anyway, so let's just focus on getting some petroleum going. Once petroleum is available, you can use it as a third power source, but I recommend to only use it when your other power reserves are low. You can control the order that power sources will turn on and off depending on how you tune their connected smart batteries. Generally, the way this works is that the higher the numbers are, the earlier that source is going to turn on. By this point, I'll usually have my natural gas generator set to 90-30, my coal generator is set to 80-20, and my petroleum generator is set to about 60-10. This basically means that I'm going to use my natural gas first because it's free, my coal second because it's pretty common, and petroleum last because of the heat and the byproducts that it creates. Petroleum can also be used for plastic, so if you opted to not ranch Drecos earlier, now's a good time to start producing at least a little bit of it. You can use a polymer press for this, but again, it produces a lot of heat and emits some CO2. Make sure you build this next to your cooling setup, and there's no need to produce a lot of plastic right now. You'll want maybe 1 ton to get your steam turbine started. We'll kick plastic production into high gear later. If you didn't start creating steel earlier, now is a good time to do it. You'll want this steel for aqua tuners, a handful of buildings that need to resist heat, and eventually for your space setup. Use a metal refinery and continue using the natural polluted water on the map, dumping it out in space after it's been emitted from the metal refinery. Don't go ham on producing from the metal refinery yet, because we will still have a much better setup going when we have heavy-duty cooling. By the way, another option to use here is you can connect your metal refinery up to a cool slush geyser or the salty version. This is useful because it comes out so cold that you could run it through the metal refinery, and for a lot of recipes that produce a ton of heat, this will still not heat it up to a point that's going to start threatening your base. So this is another option if you don't have a lot of natural polluted water. Once you have a couple tons of steel, it's time to create a heavy-duty cooling setup. Assuming a good amount of digging has been done in ice biomes, surviving on ice cooling thus far is plenty viable, but it won't last forever. A heavy-duty cooling setup will outright replace the need for this ice cooler, and this setup will be something that gets replicated several times as the game goes on. This setup is maybe the most important one in the game, and I'll have a video out soon that talks about the nuances of this setup specifically, but let's run through it really quick here. This setup consists of 3 different rooms: a pool of cold liquid, a steam room, and a room with steam turbines. I recommend stacking them like this. The bottom room is basically a big room filled with coolant with submerged liquid reservoirs in it. These liquid reservoirs will be filled with a coolant of some sort, ideally polluted water, and that will either circulate through aqua tuners or circulate throughout the base in places that you're going to need to cool down. The middle room is a vacuumed out area with about a tile of water settled at the bottom. The key building in this room is the aqua tuner, which will cool any liquids that pass through it, but they will also produce a huge amount of heat in return. This heat can be used to boil water, which will eventually fill this entire room with steam. If there are any other major heat producers, you can also put them in this room, because now that we have steam turbines, any excess heat can now be harvested for energy. I recommend using this room to help cool glass and to house the coolant that you use for your metal refinery, which will ideally be oil or petroleum. There is a lot of other things you can apply the same principle to, like capturing a metal volcano, or using any excess heat from geysers that emit at a very high temperature, like a leaky oil fissure or a hydrogen vent. The top room, connected directly to the steam room, should have 1 steam turbine for every major heat producer in the room. These turbines will suck up steam and turn it back into water, then you can dump that water back into the steam room to keep the temperature of that room at a reasonable level. The turbines themselves should be kept cool. You can always route some of the coolant you have in your coolant room up here. The combination of these machines will result in a room of coolant that is as cold as you want it to be, and then you can use that to cool circulated liquid that passes through the warmer parts of your base, keeping it habitable for duplicants, plants, and critters. Also note that I recommend having a soot bank and a double liquid lock with petroleum connected to the steam room. This is so you can add more things to your steam room as you see fit, or make repairs, and not risk dumping steam or a bunch of heat into your base. Like I mentioned, this aqua tuner and steam turbine setup is something that we're going to build a few times. One of the places that it will be useful is right next to the oil biome, so you can ship supplies out of that biome without overheating the rest of your base. The supplies I'd recommend getting out of the oil biome are fossil, lead, diamond, and iron ore, all of which are extremely useful as the game goes on. Once you have at least 1 heavy-duty cooling setup, it's time to think about taking as many geysers as you can. The geysers I'd recommend taking are a hydrogen vent, steam vents, and I mean the hot ones and not the cool steam vents, any extra water geysers that you might need, and at least 1 metal volcano. If you want to take these water geysers but not spend so much energy cooling them, there's a handful of setups that require water but won't really care about the water temperature. One of which could be pumping this hot water into an oil well to get extra oil. You can also cool the water from these geysers by mixing cold water and warm water together, or creating some kind of aquatuner setup to cool it. I'll make videos specifically about every type of geyser in the future, so check those out if you're interested. At this point, you should have a good amount of power and cooling, so we need to make sure oxygen and food are fully sustainable, meaning that we're not relying on any resources for oxygen or food that we can't fully replace either with geysers or ranching. My personally recommended food for sustainability is berry sludge. This is produced from sleet wheat and bristleberries. It literally never goes bad, allowing you to store a comical amount, and it still gives your duplicants a decent amount of morale. Your map likely has some naturally occurring sleet wheat, so if you've protected it throughout the game, it's going to be very helpful here. If not, I'll also be making a video specifically about farming sleet wheat in the future. The other ingredient in berry sludge is bristleberries, and they expect cool water to be able to grow. Keep in mind that if you're relying on meat as a food source, ranching hatches isn't technically fully sustainable unless you capture a bunch of volcanoes. Eventually, we'll want to stop hatch ranching and be able to cover our power needs with stronger sources. Drecos can be ranched entirely sustainably, considering balm lilies don't require any resources to grow. These are just some examples of food sustainability, and there's a lot of other food sources out there. The only point to this section is to make sure that the food you're growing either requires no resources to grow, or that the resources they require are 100% sustainable. Sustainable oxygen is most commonly achieved with electrolyzers. You can create a simple setup for these by pumping water into the electrolyzers, which will convert it into oxygen and hydrogen. If the room is closed off, the hydrogen will drift to the top and can be pumped out for power, and the oxygen can be pumped out of the bottom and cooled by routing it through your heavy-duty coolant room before sending it into your base. If you have any source of hot water, using it for oxygen is totally viable. Just make sure to build your electrolyzers and pumps out of something that can resist the heat, like steel. Once your power grid is stable, your food is fully sustainable, and your oxygen is running from renewable water, now it's time to start producing some important late-game resources. Specifically, you're going to want to start producing glass and ceramic. Glass is produced from the glass forge, and it comes out as a liquid, meaning it's very hot. You can dump this into your steam room if you want to get some extra energy from it, then run it through your coolant room to get it down to a reasonable temperature. We'll need a good amount of glass for solar panels later, but getting it started now is a good idea. Ceramic is made from coal and clay, and ideally you would have a good amount of clay by using deodorizers to clean polluted oxygen, and you should have a good amount of coal by now if you've been keeping up on your hatch ranching. Ceramic isn't strictly necessary, but the later parts of the game are going to be a little annoying without it. If you start early, you shouldn't need more than a couple kilns to get enough ceramic for the rest of the game. Before exiting the mid-game, I think it's essential to have way more power than you feel like you'd be able to spend, so I'd recommend a fourth power source at this point. The three most common power sources that'll carry your late game quite a bit are hydrogen, steam vents, or a geothermal plant. Even though electrolyzers produce a bit, hydrogen's really only viable as a major power source if you have a hydrogen vent or if you're using the Saturn critter traps and spaced out. Steam vents are also quite powerful, but don't always spawn on the map. The most common of these sources is geothermal, considering the idea of it is basically just to heat steam using magma. Both stagnant magma and volcanoes are very common, so you can use either one of these to provide quite a bit of power. You just need a way to control the transfer of heat between the magma and the steam so you don't overrun your turbines with too much heat. I'll also make a video specifically about this setup, but hopefully this will be enough to get the idea across. Alright, and that's about it for everything you'd want in the mid-game. Again, remember this advice is predicated on playing the base game, which I recommend completing before trying Spaced Out or the Frosty DLC. Also remember that not every run is going to be the same. You might have some slight variations from this list, so if you're having trouble with any of these, or if you're in a weird spot, let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to answer. This series will continue with a part 3 where we identify the systems for the late game, while also making the game more performant and hopefully more fun so that you can finish it and contribute to the unusually low completion percentage of Oxygen Not Included. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next part.